This week, both Canada and Europe cut interest rates. But reading between the lines, you sense any cut to rates here is much further out into the distance. You might even suggest that Australia is on a different path to those other economies as the government and the Reserve Bank try and lock in near record low unemployment rates. Keeping people in jobs, it seems, is paramount, and that is understandably important. Well, on Friday, I spoke with the recently appointed Reserve Bank Deputy Governor, Andrew Hauser, at Australia's Economic Outlook conference put on by The Australian and Sky News. He points to Australia's outstanding record of creating 2.7 million jobs in the past 10 years and says it seems there's a secret sauce here that's worth preserving.
I'll tell you something actually about commentary on fiscal policy. I was brought up in a culture where it really wasn't for central banks to provide a running commentary on the decisions that democratically elected governments take. Those are difficult decisions. They're ones that they're accountable to their electorate for. And, you know, outside of a financial crisis, and unfortunately I had to deal with one. We had to deal with the UK quite recently. I think it's for democratically elected governments to make fiscal decisions, and it's for central banks to do the job that they were given to do by the public, which is to bring inflation down to the target level and to keep it there.
So you might have noticed overnight that the European Central Bank cut interest rates by 0.25%. Apparently they did. That's what I heard. And you may have also heard that the Bank of Canada cut rates by 0.25% the previous night. Now, given the fact that the Reserve Bank is not ruling anything in or out, and the next rate move may be up or down, is Australia out of sequence as an economy, as its own monetary policy, with other economies around the world?
I don't think so. I think let's take those cases in turn because they're interesting. In Canada, the case is fairly straightforward. Their interest rates were higher than ours. Their inflation rate is lower than ours, and their unemployment rate has picked up quite a bit more substantially than ours. I think if you took those data out of Canada and you plugged them into the Australian context, you might well see a different policy stance. So Canada is in a different place in terms of the economic development, and they made the decisions that are right for them. In Europe, which obviously I've been a bit closer to in recent years, there has been a very persistent lack of growth. Now, you might say Australia has lacked growth in the most recent period, but actually if you compare the aggregate growth rate in Australia to the aggregate growth rate of continental Europe, Australia actually, as we've been hearing this afternoon, I guess, has had a pretty positive story to tell relative to continental Europe. You would much rather, I think, be living in Australia than you would in some parts of continental Europe at the moment.
Is it dangerous for a central banker to make predictions about interest rates and where they'll be in the future?
Yes.
Is that because communication today is expected to be better by central bank governors and by their staff?
I really do believe, and I know this is a difficult thing to sell, that the most important communication we can give to, let's be honest, the Australian people, who are the people who we all care about here, is that we can and will get inflation back to a stable and low level so that, and the Governor talked about this, I think, in her first press conference, inflation no longer needs to be part of their problem set. There are a lot of challenges in running a business. I was just up in Townsville in North Queensland only yesterday hearing about some of the challenges up there, and I was in Perth 2 weeks ago to try and learn about this enormous and very different economy to the one I'm used to. And, you know, you need to recruit people, you need to invest, you need to be innovating, you need to be thinking about expansions or contractions. You don't really want to be worrying about inflation. Inflation is the thing that our job is to take off the table. The same is true of your household. You've got lots of challenges in educating your children, bringing your family up, providing for them. Having something called inflation that you can't control and gets into every decision is incredibly toxic. I actually think central banks, when inflation picked up a couple of years ago, forgot this for a little period of time. They forgot just how crucial inflation has played as a role in long history. I mean, without wishing to be hyperbolic, it's caused wars. It's caused genuine breakdown in society because it is the most unfair form of economic development that I think you can really think of as developing. If you're on low incomes, if you're on fixed incomes, if you're struggling to make ends meet, inflation is a toxic thing you can't do anything about. So it's that I think we need to give people reassurance about, not that their interest rate will be at X, Y or Z.
OK, so bring it back to Australia And here, the monetary policy, the interest rate increases were not as aggressive as other parts of the world,
yes,
as you've already observed. And now we've had the message that Australia will bear a higher rate of inflation over a longer period in order to try and maintain employment because of the dual mandate now of the Reserve Bank to look after inflation and jobs. Now, those two things can run contrary to each other from time to time, and maybe are now. So the question is, the glide path down for inflation, is that something that's really been tried by many central banks before?
Well, it's interesting because when you think about where, for example, the Bank of England, which I know more about, thought inflation would get to when inflation first picked up, of course, they thought it would rise very sharply and then fall very sharply. So ex ante, as it were, ahead of time, the central bank was pretty clear that that would be a blip. I think it was called transitory, project transitory.
There were similar messages here as well.
Online called about that. Clearly, that proved to be wrong, and not just in the UK, but as you say, here and elsewhere. And we've all had to live with the fact that inflation has been much stickier, not just in the last few months, but in the last few years, as your colleague said at the beginning. We are living with inflation above target for years, not for months. And the thing that central banks and all of us have to be particularly worried about in that context is clearly that people start to think, well, hang on, maybe these guys don't mean it when they say they're going to target 2, 3, 2.5% in our case inflation. Maybe they're secretly targeting 3 or 4 or 5, or they're not very competent and they're not going to do it. And at that point, when expectations start to rise, if they do long term, they get built into wages, they get built into prices.
Well, a part of the new mandate for the Reserve Bank is that it communicate better with the public and with business. And in Andrew Hauser, I think you've just experienced that new era of communication at our central bank. Andrew Hauser, many thanks for your time.
Thank you.